When a young millionaire opened the door of his garage to let a homeless old woman and her daughter stay, no one could have predicted how that decision would change all their lives forever. But what drove a wealthy young man, living amidst luxury and glamour, to lend a helping hand to complete strangers? Behind this act of kindness lies a touching story and unexpected secrets that you simply cannot miss. But before we dive into the story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next ones. The mansion loomed like a fortress of glass and steel, its sharp lines and cold symmetry cutting against the soft light of the setting sun. Inside, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional hum of automated devices and the faint tick of a designer clock hanging on the wall. John Smith, a 30-year-old tech millionaire, sat at the edge of a sleek leather couch in the cavernous living room. His elbows rested on his knees, his hands clasped together as he stared at a photo frame clutched tightly in his grip. It was his mother, Sarah, smiling warmly in a snapshot taken years ago. Her gentle features seemed to glow with a kindness that no amount of money could replicate. John swallowed hard, the lump in his throat refusing to subside. The ache in his chest was familiar, a constant reminder of what he had lost and what he had ignored. "I should have been there, Mom," he muttered, his voice cracking under the weight of his guilt. "I should have known you needed me." The photo didn't answer, of course. It never did. The walls around him were adorned with awards and plaques, a testament to his meteoric rise in the tech world. There were photos of him shaking hands with CEOs, grinning in front of cutting-edge product launches, and accepting accolades on stage. Yet each framed moment felt hollow. They stared back at him like ghosts of his ambition, mocking him for trading love for success. John's achievements were the stuff of envy. At 25, he had launched a groundbreaking AI startup that revolutionized online security. By 28, he was worth billions, with a reputation as a visionary and a relentless innovator. But behind the curated image of triumph lay a man unraveling. The sprawling mansion in Silicon Valley, the private jets, and the state-of-the-art gadgets had done little to fill the void left by his mother's death 2 years ago. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, the insomnia etched into the dark circles under his eyes. For months, he had been plagued by sleepless nights, tormented by recurring dreams. In them, Sarah appeared, her voice urgent but indistinct, as if warning him of something he couldn't quite grasp. He would wake drenched in sweat, her face lingering in his mind like a puzzle he was too exhausted to solve. The house, though lavishly furnished, felt devoid of life. Its stark modern decor of glass tables, steel fixtures, and monochromatic tones seemed more fitting for a high-end art gallery than a home. The study, his supposed sanctuary, was the worst of all. Its polished surfaces gleamed under artificial light, the walls crammed with symbols of his success. But instead of inspiring him, the room felt like a prison. Every accolade was a reminder of time lost, of moments with Sarah he could never reclaim. Standing abruptly, John paced toward the massive floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. The skyline stretched before him, a chaotic sea of lights and movement, yet it brought no comfort. He placed the photo on a nearby table, his fingers lingering over the frame for a moment before pulling away. "I thought this was what I wanted," he whispered to the empty room. "To build something bigger than myself, to make you proud, but all I did was leave you behind." His voice cracked and he clenched his fists. He had thrown himself into work after Sarah's death, telling himself it was what she would have wanted. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had been running from the guilt, the pain, and the unbearable weight of her absence. As the night crept in, shadows stretched across the pristine walls of the mansion. John's reflection stared back at him from the window, hollow-eyed and distant. He barely recognized the man in the glass. For all his wealth, he felt like a failure, not as an entrepreneur, but as a son. Outside, a distant siren wailed, the sound fading into the background as John turned back toward the photo. Picking it up once more, he traced the outline of his mother's face with his thumb. "I'll make it right," he said softly, though the words felt empty. "I don't know how, but I'll try." The house, vast and echoing, gave no reply. The night air carried a crisp chill as John wandered aimlessly through the city. He had no destination in mind, just the overwhelming urge to escape the suffocating silence of his mansion. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, a deliberate attempt to shed the weight of his status, he blended into the shadows of the unfamiliar neighborhood. The streets here were narrow and uneven, lined with weathered buildings whose faded facades bore the weight of time and neglect. John's steps faltered as he caught sight of someone sitting cross-legged on the cracked pavement near a dimly lit alley. A woman, her hair tied in a messy bun, hunched over a sketchbook balanced on her knees. Her hand moved in quick, decisive strokes, a pencil darting across the page with practiced precision. Around her lay a few scattered belongings, a tattered backpack, a thermos, and a folded blanket. He hesitated, unsure why he felt compelled to approach. Perhaps it was the intensity of her focus, the way she seemed lost in her work despite her surroundings. Or perhaps it was the raw honesty of her presence, a stark contrast to the polished artifice of his world. Before he could think better of it, John stepped closer. The scuff of his sneakers on the concrete made her freeze. Her head snapped up, sharp eyes narrowing as they locked onto him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped and defensive. John raised his hands, palms out, in a gesture of harmlessness. "I didn't mean to startle you. I was just passing by." Her gaze flicked over him, taking in his clean clothes and cautious demeanor. Her lips curled into a sardonic smile. "Right. Rich men like you don't stop for people like me unless they want something. So, what is it?" The accusation stung more than it should have. John shook his head, taking a careful step back. "I don't want anything. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I thought your art was beautiful." The woman's eyebrows rose, her expression softening slightly, though her guard remained firmly in place. "Beautiful doesn't pay for coffee," she muttered, her voice quieter but no less biting. "But thanks." John glanced at the sketchbook, the corner of a drawing visible from his angle. It was a striking image of a young woman standing beneath a stormy sky, her hair whipping around her face. The details were intricate, the shading masterful, and the emotion it conveyed, raw, almost haunting, took his breath away. "You're really talented," he said, his voice earnest. "Do you sell your work?" The question made her laugh, though it was a dry, humorless sound. "Sell? Sure. I've got a line of buyers waiting just around the corner." She gestured dramatically to the empty street, her sarcasm sharp enough to cut. John winced, realizing too late how naive his question must have sounded. "I didn't mean to offend you," he said quickly. The woman studied him for a long moment, her pencil hovering over the sketchbook. There was a hardness in her eyes, a wariness born of years of struggle. Yet, beneath it, John thought he saw a flicker of curiosity, as though she couldn't quite figure him out. "What's your name?" she asked abruptly. "John," he replied, relieved that she hadn't immediately told him to leave. "What about you?" "Betty," she said after a pause, her tone less sharp now. "And for the record, John, people around here don't trust strangers, especially ones who look like they have money to burn." He nodded, unsure how to respond. She wasn't wrong. His presence here was an anomaly, and he could hardly blame her for being suspicious. Still, there was something about her, an honesty, a defiance, that drew him in. "I don't know why I stopped," he admitted, his voice low, "but I'm glad I did. Your work, it speaks to something, it feels real." Betty's expression softened further, though she quickly masked it with a shrug. "Thanks, I guess, but compliments don't keep the lights on, or the streets warm." John reached into his pocket, pulling out a $20 bill. He held it out to her, but she didn't take it. "I'm not a charity case," she snapped, her defenses snapping back into place. "It's not charity," John said, his tone gentle but firm. "Call it appreciation for your art. You deserve more than this." She hesitated, her fingers twitching as though tempted to accept. Finally, with a muttered curse, she snatched the bill and shoved it into her pocket. "Fine," she said, her voice begrudging, But don't think this means I owe you anything." "I don't expect anything," John replied. "Just keep drawing. The world needs more of what you can do." Betty's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, her expression unreadable. Then she returned to her sketchbook, her pencil moving once again. As John turned to leave, a strange sensation settled over him, a mix of unease and something he couldn't quite name. Betty's guarded presence, her raw talent, and her biting honesty had stirred something in him, something long buried beneath years of guilt and loneliness. He didn't know what it was yet, but he knew one thing for certain. This encounter had shifted something inside him, and it wasn't over. John found himself pacing his living room later that evening, Betty's sharp voice echoing in his mind. Her words had cut through the haze he'd been living in, challenging him in a way few people dared. She was right to be suspicious. He was a stranger who'd shown up uninvited in her world. Yet something about her had struck a chord, her talent, her resilience, her defiance. It all made him feel alive. The mansion, with its cold, lifeless walls, seemed even more oppressive now. The contrast between Betty's harsh reality and his abundance was glaring, almost obscene. He glanced at the empty garage apartment attached to the house. It had been designed as a guest space, but had never been used. He'd always thought of it as a storage room for possibilities that never materialized. Tonight, it felt like a solution waiting to be offered. Acting on impulse, John grabbed his keys and headed back into the night. Betty was still in the same spot, her pencil moving deftly across the sketchbook. She didn't look up as John approached, but her posture stiffened. "You're back," she said, without emotion, her eyes focused on her work. "What now? More compliments?" John hesitated, the words caught in his throat. This was crazy. He barely knew her, but the thought of leaving her out here, her talent wasted and her potential crushed by circumstance, gnawed at him. He cleared his throat. "I have an apartment," he began awkwardly, "in my garage. It's small, but it's clean and warm. You could stay there." That got her attention. Betty's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" John took a step back, raising his hands defensively. "I'm not trying to offend you. I can see you're struggling, and I have a space that no one's using. It's yours if you want it." She stared at him as though he'd grown a second head. "Let me get this straight. A rich guy like you is offering me, a stranger, to stay in your fancy house. Why? What's the catch?" "There's no catch," John said, his voice steady despite her skepticism. "I don't need anything from you. I just think you deserve a chance to get back on your feet." Betty's laugh was sharp, bitter. "People don't do things like that out of the goodness of their hearts. Not in my experience." "I'm not people," John said simply. She stood, her sketchbook clutched tightly to her chest. "I don't know what your game is, but if this is some kind of pity project, save it. I've been fine on my own." "Have you?" he asked softly, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. Betty's expression flickered, but she quickly masked it with a glare. She glanced at the blanket on the ground, the empty thermos at her feet. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time, John saw the exhaustion behind her defiance. "What's this place like?" she asked grudgingly. "It's basic," John admitted. "A bed, a bathroom, a small kitchen. But it's warm, and you won't have to worry about someone bothering you." Betty crossed her arms, weighing his words. Finally, she sighed. "I'll stay," she said, her voice firm. "But if I smell anything fishy, I'm out. And don't expect me to be grateful." John smiled faintly, the tension in his chest easing. "Deal." The drive to the mansion was quiet, the silence punctuated by the hum of the car engine. Betty stared out the window, her sketchbook resting on her lap. John stole a glance at her, wondering what she was thinking. When they arrived, Betty climbed out hesitantly, her eyes scanning the massive house with a mix of awe and suspicion. "Figures," she muttered. "Of course you live in a place like this." "It's not as great as it looks," John said, leading her to the garage apartment. The small space was modest compared to the rest of the mansion, but it was clean and functional. Betty walked in cautiously, her eyes darting to the bed, the kitchenette, and the small bathroom. She set her sketchbook down on the table and turned to face him. "It'll do," she said flatly, "but remember, one wrong move and I'm out." "Understood," John replied, stepping back toward the door. As he left, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something. Betty was more than a stranger. She was a spark in a life that had grown cold, and he couldn't help but wonder where this unexpected turn would lead. The steady hum of John's car engine filled the quiet driveway as he pulled up to the side entrance of the mansion. Beside him, Betty sat stiffly, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. She had barely spoken during the drive, her eyes fixed on the scenery outside as if memorizing every turn, every landmark, in case she needed to find her way back on foot. As the car came to a stop, she glanced at the sprawling building before her. The mansion's sleek, modern architecture before her beautifully decorated apartments had taken on a perfect pile of resemblance to the naked white line that leaned against the black building's walls, or stood in stark contrast to the worn streets she was used to. "You live here?" she asked, her voice tinged with incredulity. "For now," John replied with a faint smile, unbuckling his seatbelt. "It doesn't feel much like home, though." Betty didn't respond, her sharp eyes scanning the grounds as if looking for traps. Reluctantly, she stepped out of the car, her worn boots crunching against the polished gravel. The door swung open before they reached it, and Mrs. Rodriguez, the housekeeper, stood framed in the doorway. She was a woman in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair tied in a neat bun and an air of quiet authority. Her sharp gaze flickered over Betty, taking in her disheveled appearance, before settling on John. "Good evening, Mr. Smith," Mrs. Rodriguez said politely, though there was a noticeable edge to her tone. "I wasn't expecting company." "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is Betty," John said, gesturing toward her. "She'll be staying in the garage apartment for a while." The housekeeper's eyebrows shot up. "In the garage apartment?" she repeated, her skepticism evident. "Mr. Smith, are you sure that's wise?" Betty bristled, folding her arms tighter across her chest. "I'm right here, you know," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Helen believes." Mrs. Rodriguez's expression didn't waver, though her eyes narrowed slightly. "I didn't mean to offend," she said curtly, though the disapproval in her tone was clear. "But it's not every day we invite strangers into the house." "She's not just a stranger," John said firmly. "She's different." Mrs. Rodriguez turned her gaze back to him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Different doesn't mean safe," she replied. The tension in the air was palpable. Betty's jaw tightened, and she opened her mouth to fire back a retort. But John held up a hand to stop her. "She's staying," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "That's not up for debate." Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes softened slightly, though her concern remained. "Very well," she said, stepping aside to let them in. "But I hope you've thought this through, Mr. Smith." John led Betty through the house, the cavernous interior feeling even more sterile with the awkward silence hanging between them. Betty kept her arms close to her sides, her boots echoing loudly against the polished floors. "Is this place always so perfect?" she asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. John chuckled softly. "Perfect's one word for it. Empty's another." When they reached the garage apartment, he opened the door to reveal a small but well-furnished space. It had a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a bed tucked into the corner. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, but it was clean and warm. Betty stepped inside cautiously, her fingers brushing against the countertop as if testing its reality. "This is a lot," she admitted reluctantly. "It's yours," John said, "as long as you need it." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Why are you doing this?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but it feels like the right thing to do." Betty studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "Fine, but if I smell anything fishy, I'm out, and don't expect me to be grateful." John smiled faintly. "Deal." As he left her to settle in, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in the hallway, her arms crossed. "I hope you know what you're doing, Mr. Smith," she said quietly. John glanced back toward the apartment door, a thoughtful expression on his face. "So do I," he murmured. For the first time in years, his home didn't feel quite so empty, but whether this decision was a step toward healing or chaos, only time would tell. Betty had been in the garage apartment for nearly a week, and though her presence was subtle, it shifted the atmosphere of John's mansion. She came and went quietly, keeping to herself. During the day, she sketched for hours, the faint scratching of her pencil audible when John walked past the door. At night, the space fell silent, except when it didn't. The first time John heard her scream, it startled him awake. The sound cut through the stillness of the night, raw and full of anguish. He bolted upright in bed, his heart racing, unsure if he had imagined it. He debated whether to go check on her, but as he pulled on a sweatshirt, the screaming stopped. Cautiously, he approached the garage apartment, his bare feet silent against the cold floor. He paused outside the door, hesitating. From within, he could hear her voice, muffled but frantic. "No, Frank, please, no," she gasped. Then, more softly, almost a whisper, "Sarah, I'm sorry. I tried." John's stomach knotted at the mention of his mother's name. He wanted to knock, to ask her what was going on, but something held him back. Instead, he turned and retreated, leaving her to wrestle with her nightmares alone. The following morning, Betty emerged looking as though she hadn't slept. Dark circles framed her eyes, and her movements were sluggish as she carried a steaming cup of coffee back to her room. John tried to approach her in the kitchen, but her sharp glare warned him off before he could utter a word. As the days passed, Betty began to decorate her apartment in her own way. The stark, impersonal space transformed with the addition of her sketches. She taped them to the walls, each drawing more haunting and detailed than the last. One afternoon, while she was out, John stopped by the garage apartment with some groceries he thought she might need. He knocked but got no answer, so he left the bags by the door. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye through the partially open curtain. The sketches inside weren't random. They depicted a recurring figure, a young woman with soft features and kind eyes, standing in various scenes of turmoil. A storm, a darkened alley, a room full of shadows. The details were so vivid that it felt as though the woman could step off the page. John's breath hitched as he realized why the image felt so familiar. It was his mother. He stood frozen for a moment, staring at the sketches, his mind racing. How did Betty know Sarah? And why was she drawing her so obsessively? When Betty returned later that evening, John tried to act casual, though the questions burned in his throat. She said little, retreating to her apartment with barely a word of thanks for the groceries. Her eyes avoided his, her expression distant. That night, the screams returned. This time John didn't hesitate. He knocked firmly on her door, calling her name. "Betty? Are you okay?" There was a long silence before she opened the door, her face pale and damp with sweat. She stared at him, her defenses lowered for the first time since they'd met. "Just bad dreams," she muttered, her voice hoarse. "They don't mean anything." But the look in her eyes told him otherwise. As she closed the door, John resolved to find out the truth. Whatever she was hiding, it was tied to his mother, and he needed to know why. The idea struck John during one of his restless nights. He had been pacing in his study, his mind circling back to Betty's talent and the haunting sketches she had scattered across her apartment walls. Those drawings weren't just good, they were extraordinary. Beneath their raw edges lay a depth of emotion and skill that deserved recognition. The next morning, John called a contractor, determined to convert one of the unused rooms in the mansion into a proper art studio. By mid-afternoon, the space had transformed. Natural light flooded the room through large windows, the stark white walls providing the perfect canvas for creativity. Easels, paints, brushes, and blank canvases filled the room, alongside a set of comfortable chairs and tables. When it was finished, John couldn't wait to show Betty. He found her in the garage apartment, hunched over her sketchbook. Her pencil moved with an intensity that suggested she was trying to outrun whatever haunted her dreams. "Betty," he said from the doorway. She glanced up, her expression guarded as usual. "What?" "I want to show you something," he said, motioning for her to follow. She hesitated but eventually stood, tucking her pencil behind her ear. Her steps were reluctant, her posture wary as she followed him through the mansion. When he opened the door to the new studio, her breath caught and she stopped in her tracks. "What is this?" she asked, her voice low. "It's for you," John said, a tentative smile playing on his lips. "I thought you could use a proper space to paint." Betty stepped inside slowly, her fingers grazing the edge of a table laden with supplies. Her eyes roamed over the room, taking in the pristine canvases, the organized paints, and the soft light streaming in. "I can't," she began, shaking her head. "This is too much. I don't deserve this." "You deserve more than this," John said gently. "You've been through enough. Let yourself have something good for once." Her shoulders stiffened, and she turned away from him, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "I haven't painted in years, John. I don't even know if I can anymore. What's the point?" "The point is that you're talented," he replied, "and the world deserves to see that. Start small. Just try." Behaviors aren't magic, equating when a performance goes in your schedule to energy level and consistency. For a moment, Betty didn't respond. Then she let out a shaky sigh, her defenses crumbling ever so slightly. "Fine, but don't expect miracles," she muttered. The following days were a quiet transformation. At first, Betty spent hours simply sitting in the studio, staring at a blank canvas. Her frustration was palpable, and more than once, John saw her storm out, her face a mask of anger and self-doubt. But one morning, she stayed. The sound of brushstrokes filled the studio, steady and deliberate. When John passed by, he caught glimpses of her progress, a swirl of dark clouds, the outline of a figure, the suggestion of wind and rain. Slowly, the painting came to life, its layers building into something both beautiful and haunting. Finally, after nearly a week, Betty called him into the studio. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable as she stood beside the finished piece. John's breath caught the moment he saw it. The painting depicted a young woman standing in the middle of a storm, her hair and clothes whipped by violent winds. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating her face, a face John recognized instantly. It was Sarah. The resemblance was undeniable, down to the softness of her expression and the quiet strength in her eyes. But there was something else, too, a rawness, a vulnerability that made the painting almost painful to look at. "It's incredible," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. Betty didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the floor. "How did you—" he started, but the words failed him. He turned to her, his unease growing. "How do you know her?" Betty's jaw tightened and she shook her head. "It's not important," she said curtly. "Just forget it." But John couldn't forget. The painting stirred something deep within him, something he couldn't quite name. He felt as though the storm in the painting wasn't just on the canvas, it was inside him too, swirling with questions he wasn't ready to ask. As Betty left the studio, her steps hurried and her shoulders tense, John stared at the painting for a long time. The storm wasn't over, it was only just beginning. The studio had become Betty's sanctuary, a space where she could lose herself in the rhythm of brushstrokes and the blending of colors. Her work flourished in ways neither she nor John had anticipated, the canvases around her filled with breathtaking, emotional pieces that seemed to speak directly to the soul. But, despite her progress, Betty remained hesitant to share her art with the world. John, however, saw something else in her work: potential. He had been scrolling through a local forum one evening when he stumbled upon an announcement for a prestigious art competition. The theme, Light in the Storm, seemed almost tailor-made for Betty's recent painting of Sarah. The next morning, he brought it up as they stood in the studio. Betty was cleaning brushes, her hands steady and methodical, when he casually mentioned the idea. "There's this art competition coming up," John began, leaning against the doorframe. "It's a big deal. Galleries, buyers, critics, All the people who can help you get noticed. You should enter." Betty froze mid-motion, the brush still in her hand. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression a mix of skepticism and unease. "You can't be serious," she said flatly. "I'm completely serious," John replied. "Your work is incredible, Betty. People need to see it." She shook her head, setting the brush down with a deliberate motion. "That's not going to happen," she said firmly. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" John pressed, stepping closer. "Betty, this is your chance to show the world your talent. You've spent weeks creating something amazing, something that deserves recognition." Her eyes darkened, and she crossed her arms defensively. "You don't understand," she snapped. "If Frank sees this, he'll find me. He always does." The name hit John like a cold gust of wind. He remembered it from the nights when her screams echoed through the mansion. The way she said it now, with equal parts fear and loathing, sent a chill down his spine. "Who is Frank?" he asked gently. Betty hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. For a moment it seemed like she might not answer. Then, in a voice laced with bitterness, she said, "He's the reason I lost everything. My career, my name, my family. Gone. Because of him." John's brow furrowed as he watched her, his concern growing. "Betty, I don't know what he did to you, but hiding isn't the answer. If this competition can give you a chance to rebuild your life, shouldn't you take it?" Her laugh was bitter and hollow. "You think it's that easy? Frank isn't just some bad memory, John. He's dangerous. He has connections, power. If he recognizes my work, he'll track me down. And I can't let that happen." "You're not alone anymore," John said, his voice steady. "If he comes after you, we'll deal with him together. But you can't let fear stop you from living your life." Betty's eyes flicked up to meet his, searching for something in his face. Slowly, she uncrossed her arms, though her expression remained uncertain. "And what if he finds me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then we'll be ready," John said firmly. "You're stronger than you think, Betty, and your art is worth the risk." The room fell silent as Betty considered his words. Her fingers traced the edge of the nearest canvas, her thoughts clearly racing. Finally, she exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Fine," she said reluctantly. "I'll do it, but don't expect me to smile and play nice if this all goes south." John smiled, relief washing over him. "Deal. I'll handle the entry process. You just focus on being the amazing artist you are." As he left the studio, a flicker of hope stirred in him. Betty's work deserved to be seen, and no matter what ghosts from her past threatened to emerge, he was determined to help her face them. For now, though, all he could do was prepare for the storm ahead. The storm that Betty had been trying to keep at bay finally broke one evening as she and John stood in the studio. The painting she had been working on, a vivid, almost surreal depiction of a young woman cradling a child amidst swirling shadows, seemed to have triggered something in her. She stared at it with trembling hands, her expression haunted. John noticed her distress immediately. "Betty," he said gently, stepping closer. "What's wrong?" At first she didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the canvas as though it held a power over her. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and unsteady. "I shouldn't have painted this," she murmured. John frowned, concern etched across his face. "Why not? It's incredible." She shook her head sharply, turning away from the painting. "You don't get it," she snapped, though the anger in her voice seemed more directed at herself than at him. It's not just a painting. It's my past, the part I've spent years trying to forget." John's heart sank. He had known Betty was carrying heavy burdens, but he hadn't pressed her for details. Now, it seemed, those details were forcing their way to the surface. "Betty," he said softly, "talk to me. Please." She hesitated, her arms wrapping around herself as though to hold her pieces together. The silence stretched, but when she finally spoke, Her words spilled out in a rush, raw and unfiltered. "His name is Frank," she began, her voice breaking. "He wasn't always the monster he is now. When I first met him, he was an art dealer, charismatic and ambitious. He promised me the world, a gallery to showcase my work, connections to buyers, everything an artist dreams of." John stayed silent, letting her continue at her own pace. "For a while it was perfect," she said bitterly. "Too perfect. Frank made me believe I couldn't succeed without him, and by the time I realized how manipulative he was, it was too late. He owned everything. My paintings, my reputation, even my name, and when I tried to leave, he made sure I couldn't." Her voice cracked and she sank into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands. John knelt beside her, his heart aching at the sight of her pain. "That's not all," she said after a moment, her words muffled but steady. "Frank didn't just ruin my career. He took everything. My career, my name, my child." She looked up at John, her eyes brimming with tears. "I left Sarah to save her from him, but it wasn't enough. He found us, and I had to disappear completely to protect her. It's why I've been running ever since." The air in the room grew heavy as John processed her words. His mother's name, Sarah, echoed in his mind, and a chill ran down his spine. "Sarah," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your daughter's name was Sarah?" Betty nodded, tears streaming down her face. "She was everything to me," she said, her voice trembling. "But I couldn't protect her the way I wanted to. I had to leave, had to trust that she'd be safer without me." John's breath caught, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed falling into place. He thought of the sketches in Betty's apartment, the uncanny resemblance between her work and his mother. "Betty," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think there's something you need to know about Sarah." Her head snapped up, a flicker of hope and fear in her eyes. "What?" He hesitated, unsure how to say it. "My mother's name was Sarah," he began carefully. "And from everything you've told me, I think she was your daughter." The shock on Betty's face was immediate. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing as though trying to form words. Finally, she managed to whisper, "No, that can't be." But deep down, she knew it was true. The connection she had felt to John, the familiar features she couldn't quite place. It all made sense now. Tears spilled freely as she reached for his hand. "John," she said, her voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to leave her. I never wanted to leave you." John gripped her hand tightly, his own eyes glistening. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We'll face this together." For the first time in years, Betty allowed herself to hope, but she also knew that their shared past wasn't finished with them yet, and Frank's shadow still loomed large over their fragile new beginning. The evening air in the studio was thick with unspoken tension. Betty stood near the window, staring out at the fading twilight, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. John leaned against the far wall, watching her carefully, sensing that something was boiling beneath the surface. For days now, she had been quieter than usual, her movements more tentative, as if she were bracing for an unseen storm. Finally, she broke the silence. "You don't understand what you're asking me to do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. John frowned. "Betty, it's just a competition. You're talented, and you deserve to show the world what you can do." She turned to face him, her eyes sharp and filled with a mix of fear and anger. "It's not just a competition," she snapped. "It's a spotlight, a beacon for the one person I've spent years trying to hide from." John straightened, his concern deepening. "Frank," he said, the name landing like a stone in the quiet room. Betty's shoulders tensed at the sound of it. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "You want to know who Frank is? Fine. He's the man who destroyed my life." She began pacing, her movements quick and agitated as she spoke. When I first met him, he was everything I thought I needed. Charming, successful, connected. He promised me the world. And for a while, he delivered. My art was in galleries, my name was in magazines, and I thought I was finally living the dream I'd worked so hard for. Her voice broke, and she stopped pacing, gripping the back of a chair for support. But it wasn't real. None of it was. Frank didn't just promote my work. He owned it. Every piece I created, every deal I made, it all went through him. And when I tried to leave, when I realized he was controlling me, he made sure I couldn't. John's jaw tightened, anger flaring in his chest. What did he do? Betty let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. What didn't he do? He destroyed my reputation, spread lies about me to every gallery owner, every buyer. He made sure no one would touch my work unless it came through him. And when that didn't break me, he went after what I cared about most. My daughter. Her voice cracked and she sank into the chair, burying her face in her hands. He took everything. My career, my name, my child. I left Sarah to save her from him, but it wasn't enough. He still found us, still used her as leverage to keep me in line. I had no choice but to disappear. I thought if I stayed away, if I vanished, he'd stop. But he never stops. The weight of her words settled over the room, and for a moment all John could do was stare at her, his heart breaking for the pain she had endured. Slowly, he moved to sit across from her, his voice soft but resolute. You did what you had to do to protect her, he said. No one can blame you for that. Betty lifted her tear-streaked face to meet his gaze. But it wasn't enough, she whispered. I failed her, John. I failed my daughter. John's mind raced, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. Sarah. The name wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. His mother's face flashed in his mind, and a chill ran down his spine. Betty, he said carefully, your daughter's name was Sarah? She nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing in confusion. Yes. Why? John hesitated, the words catching in his throat. Because my mother's name was Sarah, and I think she might have been your daughter. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Betty's sharp intake of breath. She stared at him, her expression shifting from disbelief to realization. No, she whispered, shaking her head. That's not possible. It can't be. But deep down she knew it was true. The sketches, the connection she had felt to John, it all made sense now. John reached across the table, taking her trembling hand in his. We'll figure this out, he said firmly. Whatever it takes, we'll find the truth. Together. Betty gripped his hand tightly, her tears falling freely. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. But even as the truth began to surface, she knew that facing it would bring them both closer to the danger she had fought so hard to escape. The mansion was quiet as the evening light filtered through the large windows, painting the walls with a warm glow. Betty sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea in front of her. She wasn't drinking it. Her hands trembled too much to lift the cup. John sat across from her, reviewing some papers, his face calm and focused. It had been weeks since her confession about Frank, and while their bond had deepened, a new tension had taken root. Betty had been connecting the dots in her mind, piecing together memories, faces, and timelines. The conclusion she had reached was staggering, almost too much to believe. John, she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. He looked up, startled by the seriousness in her tone. Yeah? She hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I need to tell you something. And it's not easy to say. John set the papers aside, leaning forward. You can tell me anything, Betty. You know that. Her lips pressed together tightly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I've been thinking about Sarah, about everything I told you, and there's something I didn't realize until now. John's brow furrowed in confusion. What is it? She took a shaky breath, her voice trembling. Your mother, Sarah. She was my daughter. That makes me your grandmother. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, John simply stared at her, his expression frozen in disbelief. Then he let out a nervous laugh, shaking his head. "No," he said, his voice unsteady. "That can't be. She never said anything. She would have told me if that were true." Betty's eyes filled with tears as she reached across the table, her hand trembling as it covered his. "She couldn't, John. She was protecting you. From Frank. From the past. I think she didn't want you to carry the burden of what happened to me." John pulled his hand back, standing abruptly. He began pacing the room, running his hands through his hair. "This doesn't make sense," he said, his voice rising. "Why wouldn't she tell me? Why wouldn't she want me to know my own family?" Betty's voice broke as she spoke. "Because she loved you, John. She wanted you to have a life free from the pain and chaos that Frank brought into ours. She must have thought it was the only way to keep you safe." He stopped pacing, turning to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, confusion, and grief. "But she lied to me. My whole life, she lied." "She didn't lie," Betty said gently, standing to face him. "She made a choice no mother should ever have to make. And it was all for you." John sank into a nearby chair, his head in his hands. The weight of her words pressed down on him like a tidal wave. Memories of his mother flooded his mind, her warm smile, her reassuring words, her endless support. Now, those memories were tinged with a new layer of complexity. "You're saying all of this, everything, is because of Frank?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Betty nodded, her own tears spilling over. "Yes. He took everything from me, John. And in trying to save Sarah, I lost her, too. But I never stopped thinking about her, and now, finding you, it's like a miracle I never thought I'd have." John looked up at her, his expression softening as the truth settled into his heart. "You're really my grandmother?" Betty nodded, her voice steady despite her tears. "I am." A long silence followed, the weight of their shared history binding them together in a way neither had expected. Finally, John stood and stepped closer to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I don't know what to do with all of this," he admitted, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Neither do I," Betty said, holding him tightly. "But we'll figure it out, together." For the first time, the mansion didn't feel so empty. The truth, as painful as it was, had created something new, a bond they could build on. But they both knew the shadow of Frank still loomed, and the battle for closure was far from over. The days in the mansion had grown quieter, but the silence between Betty and John wasn't uncomfortable. It was contemplative. They had settled into an unspoken rhythm of understanding, each respecting the other's space, yet a bond had formed that neither could deny. But for Betty, the realization of their true connection gnawed at her, growing louder in her mind with each passing moment. One evening, as they sat in the living room, John leafing through a book while Betty stared absently at the fireplace, the weight of the truth became unbearable. She had rehearsed the words in her mind countless times, yet none of them seemed right, but she couldn't wait any longer. "John," she said, softly, her voice breaking the stillness. He looked up, noticing the tremor in her voice. "Yeah? What's on your mind?" She hesitated, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. Her eyes, usually sharp and guarded, were now filled with vulnerability. "I've been thinking about Sarah, about your mother." John closed the book, giving her his full attention. "What about her?" Betty took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting nervously. "There's something I need to tell you, something I should have realized sooner, but it's hard to say." John frowned, concern creeping into his expression. "You can tell me anything, Betty, you know that." She nodded, but didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she stared at her hands, her voice trembling as she spoke. "John, your mother was my daughter. That makes me your grandmother." For a moment, the words didn't register. John stared at her, his mind racing to catch up. Then he let out a shaky laugh, shaking his head. "No," he said, his voice incredulous. "That can't be. She never said anything. Why wouldn't she tell me?" Betty's eyes filled with tears as she finally looked at him. "Because she was trying to protect you," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "From Frank. From the past. She didn't want you to grow up with the shadows that haunted her." John stood abruptly, pacing the room as if the movement could help him make sense of what he'd just heard. "This doesn't make any sense," he said, his voice rising. "She raised me, loved me, told me stories about her life. Why would she leave something like this out?" "Because she didn't want you to carry the weight of what happened," Betty said, her voice breaking. "She wanted you to have a life free from the pain she endured." John stopped, turning to face her, his expression a mixture of anger, confusion, and grief. "So, what?" he said, his voice raw. "She just erased you from our lives? Pretended you didn't exist?" Betty flinched at his words but held her ground. "She didn't erase me, John. She saved me. And she saved you too. I made mistakes that put her in danger. Leaving her behind was the only way I knew to keep her safe. And when she grew up, she made the same choice for you." The room was silent except for the sound of John's heavy breathing. He sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair. "This is a lot," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Betty said softly, "and I don't expect you to forgive me or even understand. But I loved her, John. I loved her more than anything. And finding you, now, after all these years, it feels like I've been given a second chance. A chance to make things right." John looked up at her, his expression softer now, though the confusion remained. "You're really my grandmother?" Betty nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I am." For a moment, they just looked at each other, the weight of the revelation hanging between them. Then, slowly, John stood and crossed the room to her. He pulled her into a tentative embrace, his arms tightening as she began to sob against his shoulder. "I don't know how to feel about this," he admitted, his voice shaky. "But I do know I don't want to lose you now." Betty held him tightly, her tears soaking into his shirt. "You won't," she whispered. "I promise." For the first time, they both felt a fragile sense of healing begin to take root. But as they clung to each other, they both knew the hardest part of their journey was still to come. Frank's shadow still loomed, and the truth they had uncovered would bring more challenges than either of them could anticipate. The day of the art exhibition arrived with an air of both excitement and tension. The gallery buzzed with anticipation as critics, buyers, and art enthusiasts wandered through the space, admiring the work of the contestants. Betty's piece, a stunning and deeply emotional painting of a young woman standing defiantly in the middle of a storm, drew significant attention. It was a raw depiction of resilience, and its power was undeniable. John stood by Betty's side, watching as people murmured their admiration. He could see her nerves beneath her calm facade, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her scarf. He leaned closer and whispered, "You're doing great. They love it." Betty managed a small smile, but her eyes darted around the room, scanning the crowd. She had been uneasy all day, a shadow of fear following her, despite John's reassurances. And then she saw him. Frank. He entered the gallery with the confidence of a man who owned the place, his tailored suit and polished shoes cutting a sharp figure among the crowd. His silver-streaked hair and charming smile exuded power, but his eyes were cold, calculating. Betty froze, her face draining of color. "John," she whispered, gripping his arm. "He's here." John followed her gaze, his own posture stiffening as he saw the man approach. Frank's smile widened as he spotted them, his gaze settling first on Betty, then shifting to John. "Elizabeth," Frank said smoothly, his voice dripping with false charm. "Still clinging to dreams, I see." He turned his attention to John, sizing him up with a predator's keen eye. And you must be the boy, Sarah's son. I wondered if you'd inherited her stubbornness." John stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Betty. His voice was calm but firm as he replied, "I inherited her courage, something you'll never understand." Frank's smirk faltered for a split second before he recovered, his smile returning. "Courage," he mused, tilting his head. "Is that what you think this is? Dragging Elizabeth back into the spotlight, exposing her to a world she left for good reason?" "She's here because she deserves to be," John shot back. "Her work speaks for itself, and nothing you say or do can change that." Betty found her voice, her grip on John's arm loosening. "What are you doing here, Frank?" she demanded, her tone cold but steady. Frank placed a hand over his heart in mock offense. "Why, Elizabeth, I came to admire your work, of course. It's been far too long since I've seen one of your pieces. I must say, it's impressive, emotional, evocative, though I wonder, was it worth the risk?" "You don't scare me anymore," Betty said, her voice gaining strength. "You've taken enough from me. You don't get to take this, too." Frank's smile twisted into something darker. "You've always been bold, but boldness doesn't win wars, Elizabeth. Strategy does. And you, my dear, are woefully unprepared." Before John could respond, a gallery organizer approached, breaking the tense moment. "Ms. Elizabeth, a reporter would like to interview you about your piece." Betty hesitated, glancing at John. He gave her a reassuring nod. "Go," he said. "I'll handle this." As Betty walked away, Frank turned back to John, his charming facade gone. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that," he said. "But you're playing a dangerous game. You have no idea what you're up against." John's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe not, but I know this much. You don't win by running or hiding. You win by standing up to bullies like you." Frank chuckled, stepping closer. "Careful, boy. You're stepping into waters far deeper than you realize." "And you're standing on thin ice," John replied, his voice steady. For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the air crackling with unspoken tension. Then Frank stepped back, his smirk returning. "Enjoy the evening," he said lightly, turning and disappearing into the crowd. As Betty returned, her eyes searched John's face for signs of what had transpired. "What did he say?" "Nothing I didn't already know," John replied, his voice calm but determined. "He's trying to intimidate us, but we're not backing down." Betty's lips tightened into a thin line, but she nodded. "No, we're not." Together, they stood before her painting, the storm depicted on the canvas mirroring the one they were preparing to face. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, they felt ready. The gallery was packed with patrons, critics, and artists, the room buzzing with lively conversation. Betty's painting had become the centerpiece of the exhibition, drawing a steady stream of admirers. But the air around her and John felt electric with tension. They had planned for this moment, but that didn't make it any less daunting. John stood at Betty's side, his jaw set with quiet determination. Nearby, Mike, an old friend of Betty's and a private investigator, waited in the wings with the evidence they had painstakingly gathered. Tonight was about more than art. It was about justice. Frank, as expected, was mingling effortlessly among the crowd, his charm on full display as he worked to undermine Betty's credibility. John caught snippets of his smooth voice. "Oh, Elizabeth? Talented, yes, but troubled. You know how artists can be." When the time came, John took the stage under the guise of delivering a thank you speech for Betty's participation. The crowd fell silent as he began to speak. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate incredible talent and the resilience of the human spirit," John began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "But tonight, there's a deeper truth that needs to be revealed, one that has been hidden for far too long." The room stirred, confused murmurs rippling through the crowd. Frank froze mid-conversation, his smile fading as he turned to face the stage. "For years," John continued, "Betty's talent was stifled, not because she lacked skill or ambition, but because of one man, Frank." Gasps erupted from the audience, all eyes now on Frank, whose face darkened. He stepped forward, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This is absurd!" he exclaimed, his polished veneer cracking. "Elizabeth has always been prone to drama. You can't seriously believe this nonsense." John ignored him, signaling to Mike, who stepped forward with a folder of documents. "We have evidence," John said, his voice ringing with conviction. "Emails, contracts, testimonials from other artists, all detailing how Frank exploited and silenced those under his so-called guidance." Mike handed the folder to a journalist in the front row, who began flipping through it with wide eyes. Others leaned in to see, the murmurs growing louder. Frank's charm turned to fury. "You think you can smear my name with fabricated lies? This is defamation!" he snarled. Betty stepped forward then, her voice shaking but strong. "For years I let you silence me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You took everything from me, my career, my name, my daughter. You thought I'd stay afraid forever, but not anymore." Her words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The crowd watched, spellbound, as her emotions poured out. Frank's mask slipped entirely. He pointed a finger at Betty, his voice dripping with venom. "You'll regret this, Elizabeth. You've always been impulsive, and this will be your downfall." John stepped in front of Betty, his voice cold and unwavering. "No, Frank, you will." At that moment, other voices rose from the crowd. Several former artists who had worked with Frank stepped forward, sharing their own stories of manipulation and coercion. The gallery buzzed with their testimonies, each one further unraveling Frank's carefully constructed image. Frank's confidence crumbled as the weight of the evidence and witnesses bore down on him. Security arrived at the gallery, alerted by the growing chaos. "This isn't over," Frank hissed as he was escorted out, his face a mask of fury. Betty watched him go, her body trembling but her eyes clear. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of his shadow lifting. John placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft but resolute. "It's over for him, and it's just the beginning for you." The gallery erupted into applause, the crowd rallying behind Betty and her courage. She wiped her tears, a small tentative smile breaking through. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was free. As John and Betty stood together, the storm that had once loomed so large in their lives began to fade, leaving room for the light to break through. The applause in the gallery was deafening, a wave of support that buoyed Betty as she stood by her painting, tears still glistening on her cheeks. John was by her side, his hand steady on her shoulder, offering strength she hadn't felt in years. The storm that had loomed over their lives was finally breaking, and for the first time, Betty felt like she could breathe freely. But just as the room began to settle, the air seemed to shift. A figure stepped through the crowd, tentative yet determined. At first, Betty didn't notice, but John's sharp intake of breath caught her attention. She followed his gaze, her heart stopping as she saw her. Sarah. She was older, her hair streaked with silver and her face lined with years of struggle, but there was no mistaking her. Sarah, the daughter Betty had thought lost forever, stood just a few feet away, her eyes filled with tears. "Sarah," Betty whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. The room seemed to blur around them as Sarah took a hesitant step forward, her eyes locking onto John. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the space, cutting through the stunned silence. "John," she said, her voice breaking. "John, I'm so sorry I stayed away. I thought it was the only way to keep you safe." John froze, his mind struggling to process the impossible. His mother, the woman he had mourned for years, stood before him, alive and trembling. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Mom, I thought I'd lost you forever." Without hesitation, he crossed the distance between them, pulling her into a tight embrace. Sarah clung to him, sobbing into his shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she repeated, her words muffled. I never wanted to leave you, but I had no choice. Frank, he would have destroyed everything if I'd stayed." John held her tightly, his own tears falling freely. "You don't have to explain," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're here, now. That's all that matters." Betty watched the reunion, her hand pressed to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. She wanted to move, to speak, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. It was Sarah who finally turned to her, her expression shifting from relief to something deeper, recognition, love, and regret. "Mom," Sarah said softly, her voice trembling, "it's been so long." The word hit Betty like a bolt of lightning, and she staggered forward, her arms reaching out. "Sarah," she choked, her voice breaking as she pulled her daughter into her arms. "My Sarah, I thought I'd lost you forever." They clung to each other, years of pain and separation melting away in an embrace that felt both fragile and unbreakable. Around them, the gallery fell into a hushed reverence, the audience sensing the enormity of the moment. Finally, Sarah pulled back, her eyes moving between John and Betty. "I thought staying away was the only way to protect you both," she said, her voice steadying. "Frank's reach was too far, his power too great. I couldn't risk it. But when I heard what you did tonight, I knew I had to come back. I had to face him, and I had to see you." John shook his head, still holding her hand tightly. "You don't have to run anymore, Mom. He's finished. We're together now, and nothing's going to tear us apart again." Sarah smiled through her tears, her gaze filled with a love that had never faded. "I missed you both so much," she said, "and I'm so proud of you, for your courage, for your strength." Betty, her voice thick with emotion, added, "You're home now, Sarah, and we're not letting you go." The three of them stood together, their reunion a testament to resilience, love, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Around them, the crowd began to clap again, the applause this time a celebration of more than art. It was a celebration of a family reunited against all odds. As the night wore on, the storm that had defined their lives finally faded, leaving room for a brighter, hopeful dawn. The weeks following the exhibition felt like stepping into a new chapter, not just for Betty, John, and Sarah, but for the entire house that had once been so lifeless. Frank's arrest had sent ripples through the art world, his crimes against countless artists finally exposed. Witness testimonies and irrefutable evidence ensured he would face justice, and the weight of his shadow was lifted from their lives. But the scars he left behind lingered. Healing wasn't instant, but it was steady, like a slow sunrise after a long night. Sarah moved into the mansion, her presence filling a void John hadn't even realized was so vast. The once cold, sterile halls began to feel alive with the sound of laughter, conversation, and shared meals. Betty's paintings found a place on every wall, each one transforming the house into a gallery of love and resilience. One evening, the three of them sat together in the living room, the fire crackling warmly in the hearth. Betty worked on a new sketch at the coffee table, while Sarah flipped through a photo album she had unearthed from storage. John sat back, watching them both, a contented smile on his face. "This house feels different now," he said softly, breaking the silence. Betty looked up, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. "That's because it is," she replied with a small smile. "It's not just a house anymore, it's a home." Sarah glanced at her son, her eyes shining with gratitude. "And it's because of you, John. You brought us back together. You gave us a second chance." John shook his head, his voice steady but full of emotion. "No, Mom. We gave each other a second chance." He leaned forward, his gaze serious as he continued. "No more secrets. No more running. We're a family again." Betty nodded, her voice firm yet tender. "And we'll face whatever comes next together." The words carried a weight of promise, of love, and of unity. For so long, each of them had lived in fragments, separated by fear, guilt, and loss. But now, those fragments were coming together, forming something stronger, something whole. As the weeks turned into months, the mansion blossomed with life. The walls, once bare and impersonal, became a testament to their journey. Betty's art, vivid and emotive, filled every room. Sarah contributed her own touches, plants in sunny corners, photographs of happier times, and small mementos that made the house feel warm and lived in. John transformed the expansive backyard into a garden, a place for all of them to work together, to grow something new, just as they were growing as a family. Even the staff, led by a now beaming Mrs. Rodriguez, commented on how the energy of the house had changed. One afternoon, as John walked through the house, he paused in front of one of Betty's newest paintings. It was of a young woman standing under a stormy sky, but this time, the storm was breaking. Light poured through the clouds, illuminating the woman's face, which was filled with hope and quiet strength. Sarah came to stand beside him, following his gaze. "It's beautiful," she said softly. John nodded. "It is, and it feels like us." Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her voice filled with love. "That's because it is." As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, the house was filled with the sounds of their laughter and conversation. The walls that had once echoed with emptiness now pulsed with warmth and life. The lesson of their journey was clear. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about embracing it, learning from it, and using it to forge a brighter future. The mansion, once a monument to loneliness, had become a sanctuary of love, art, and hope. And as the family sat together, the firelight dancing around them, it was clear that this was more than a resolution. It was a new beginning. The echoes of their past still lingered, but they no longer defined them. Together, they were writing a new story, one filled with the colors of resilience, courage, and unshakable love.